Hello and welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm your host, Dale the Real Seeker, and today I have a special treat for you. My friend and mentor, Gary Habermas, is back on with us. Hey there, Gary.
How you doing, Dale? Good to see you
Um,
up in sunny, I hope, Canada.
you know what? No, it's raining today.
It's raining here too, and I'm a long way away. I'm due south of you, but I'm a long way away from you.
Oh goodness, what can you do? But
Yeah,
um, so yeah, Gary was kind enough to come on. The last time he came on my show, we discussed the resurrection, and I asked him at the end, what kind of topics, since you're doing me the favor of coming on my show, what kind of topics would you want to look at or to address? And you mentioned an interesting topic on the creeds. So that's going to be our topic of focus: is what's the evidence of the creeds. But just before we get into that, if you just want to take maybe a couple minutes, Gary, just to explain to the audience what you're doing, like new projects or stuff like that. Yeah, what's the latest on you?
well, a lot of people know that I'm doing this magnum opus because I'm on a couple of research sites, and one of them at least, maybe both of them, but one of them for sure asked me to give updates periodically, and a whole lot of people have been checking in. So word gets around. I get emails all the time. How you doing? How long? One guy wrote to me. I had no idea who he was. He wrote to me and he said, "Hey, let me know when that thing's ready to come out." He said, "I need to get a second mortgage on my home." uh, up in Toronto there, that'd bring you some pretty good bucks with the real estate prices up there. But
Sure.
it's going well. 1 week ago, week and a half ago, I finished the first draft of the magnum opus. I don't know why my pages are coming out differently. Depends on how I add them up. I've got chapters all over the place. I've got 70 something chapters, but I've added the pages up twice, and the count comes to between 4,800 and 5,400 pages. So I'm
Wow.
going to say about that average would be like 5,100 pages right now. So it's a lot. It also depends on how long certain things turn out to be. My research assistant, who just finished his PhD, and by the way, did both his master's thesis and his PhD dissertation on the resurrection. So he's a guy you're going to be hearing from. He's written had about 15 publications already. Name's Ben Shaw. Ben is actually editing one of the full volumes for me. It is something that everybody, including Richard Carrier, has asked me about, several times in the last 15 years. But they want to know, where's this big research document of mine where I document everybody's views, where all I do is I don't argue with them. All I do is document where they are. If you can believe this, on 140 sub-questions relative to the crucifixion, burial, resurrection, and ascension of Jesus. 140 questions. And I line thousands of sources up, notes from thousands of sources. And that right now stands at about 1,600 pages, just that.
Wow.
And Ben is editing what I think will be a standalone book in this series. I don't mean a separate book. Whoever gives me a contract, I want all the books together. And I think this will be a whole book by itself because it's incredibly large. He's only done the first 100 pages out of 1,500, and he's got something like 200 or 300 footnotes in 200 pages. No, he's got way more than that because he usually has 4 or 5 footnotes a page.
That's
Anyway, that's where I am. And by the way, your creeds topic, I went on there a little bit because I figured anybody who wanted to listen to the creeds would also might want to hear update on the resurrection because, in my opinion, the creeds could very well be the strongest historical argument for the resurrection. If you maybe pick a topic or an evidence, you say, well, what are the best evidences for the resurrection? Well, just to give 3 real quickly, I would say Paul's writings are number 1. Everybody says that. So Paul's writings are number 1. What Paul tells us, the 1 Corinthians 15 creed, again, what Paul tells us is number 1. I would say a second argument would be this creedal argument. Many of them are in Paul, but many of them are not in Paul. So the creeds argument, number 2. And once you get Paul and the creeds, then you can bring the Gospels in and bring their data. And I think you and I have talked about this at Linkdale back in your searching days. I think the number 1 appearance, the most evidenced appearance, is the appearance of the 12. I think that is by far the best attested, which, by the way, raises another fourth category of evidence, and that's the criteria. What criteria we have for these arguments, historical criteria, checks and balances. So that brings the Gospels into it. So I would say Paul, the creeds, the criteria, and the Gospels are the four big punches in favor of the resurrection. And creeds might be number one. By the way, I know you love the shroud. If you put the shroud in there, that's five. That's five big, not five arguments. Those are five categories that have many arguments underneath them. So enough said. This is just super important for the resurrection.
Yeah, I think that was important to get in there, especially for the audience as well, to contextualize what are the different evidences that support the resurrection. And as you said, I agree with you. I think the creedal arguments are very powerful, and people are familiar with those. But
there's reasons reasons that they're not. I mean, the typical scholarly skeptical response. Sorry for interrupting you, Dale.
Oh, no worries.
My first response is that critics, I would say it. I was a huge skeptic for 10 years and straight, and then part of 10 more years. That's 20 years. And by the way, a report recently came out and said, yeah, when he was in his teens, my doubt started in my teens, yeah, but it said when he was in his teens, he considered Buddhism and almost converted. Well, they made it sound like I was in my teens when I was affected by Buddhism. Hey, listen, I already had my PhD when I had those doubts about Buddhism. So the doubts were very deep and very long. And if I were in that skeptical mindset, I would say, oh, come on, creeds. Let's just say they're everything you say they are, and everything that Bart Ehrman and Gerhard Ludemann, atheists, New Testament scholars, everything they concede about them. That's great. But it's only hearsay evidence. It's only he said, she said. That's all it is. But when someone finds out what the creeds are, it kills the he said, she said component, and it makes them very, very early. And now it translates to early data from those who were there. That is hard to refute.
Yeah, I think that was a great sort of segue into just maybe briefly. So I know the first couple questions are just sort of general questions, and you've kind of hinted at this, but maybe in just a couple minutes, can you, for those that aren't familiar with these oral traditions or creeds, what exactly are they? What are the different types of oral traditions? Is it all creeds? Do we have other types of traditions? Just give us sort of a quick general introduction.
Yeah, your implication there is tremendous. Yes, because there are different species, and most of them are called creeds, and there are roughly synonyms for these creeds. We can call them, synonyms would be, I'd say after the word creed, my second favorite word is traditions. In fact, they're called traditions in the New Testament. They're called traditions. So you have creeds, traditions, confessions. There's another early word for them, preaching points. And a very popular name for some of these are sermon summaries. And when you say sermon summaries, you're mostly dealing with Acts chapters 1 through 5, 10, 13, and a few others. In fact, I've got a book. I mean, I'm here in my library, so I look over at my shelf. Whenever I say a book, I look over at it. And it's a very prestigious book that Oxford University Press published it. And I required it for a textbook for PhD students. And one of them, who's had 42 hours in Greek and Hebrew, he's reading the background for this book. And the book's called Semitisms in the Book of Acts, where Acts draws on ancient Semitic testimony, which is usually said to be the earliest behind the Gospels. And this guy had 42 hours of Greek and Hebrew, and he said he really struggled with how technical the material was on Semitisms in Acts. Acts is full of them. And those are called sermon summaries. And so here's the idea behind creeds. Oh, by the way, I'm only telling you what they're called. They also are different kinds. You have doctrinal creeds. You have historical creeds that give data. You have worship creeds that very obviously were used in worship services. like may the grace of God and so on dwell with the last verse. I think it is in 2 Corinthians. There's an example, and some of them are those kind liturgical kind of creeds. Some of them are prayers. So personal devotion, group devotion, teaching, history, preaching, those are different species of creeds. But here's what they are. In the ancient world, especially around the Mediterranean, the cultures were oral cultures, and they are way, way better than we are today at memorizing large blocks of material. For example, if you studied to be a rabbi, a Sadducee, a Pharisee, the Pharisees were like really the scripture guys, and if you studied to do that, a lot of what you did, you couldn't go to the corner bookstore. And scrolls were good for the synagogues, but papyri was really expensive. When you have to cut every reed, slice it, open it up, dry it out, how much would you get from a reed? I mean, might it be an inch across after you open it up? I don't know. But you're going to need a lot of them to make a scroll. They're very expensive. Then you have to pay somebody to write on them. I mean, they would be inestimably expensive. And so that's probably also why so much memorizing was done. Here's another reason. Most of Jesus's hearers, estimates go anywhere from 40 to 90% of Jesus's hearers, 70 is a nice figure, but about 70% or so of Jesus's listeners were illiterate. So you can't say, hey, do you want to borrow my super expensive scroll and read it? They're either going to tell you I can't read, or they're going to pretend like they can read and they can't. Yeah. So when you're getting ideas across to people, like any good teacher, you repeat the ideas over and over. I'll be doing that several times here. I hope that means I'm a good teacher. You repeat these phrases over and over, and you emphasize the important ones over the lesser important ones. And that's what they do. So what happens? They're oral. Well, you go, well, how long did it take to write these things down? Well, the first gospel, Mark, most people date, I just read a report on this, most people date Mark 65 to 75. That is 35 to 45 years after Jesus. Now, a lot of people think, are you kidding me? That's a long time. Well, I'll tell you what. You look at ancient documents in the ancient world, and you tell me how many major documents for major people where you confidently say Alexander the Great did this, Buddha did that, and then you find out, well, here, take the secular one. What's the earliest source for Alexander the Great? Earliest major report. There were people who wrote about Alexander while he lived. And someday we may be lucky enough to find those books in ancient monasteries, but right now we don't have them. The earliest book on Alexander is just short of 300 years after he died. If I told you the first gospel is 300 years after Jesus, you wouldn't even talk to me if you were a skeptic. You'd walk away from me. I go 35 years. And when people just show their ignorance, frankly, by saying, oh, that's so long, say, well, you know, Alexander's 10 times that. 10 times. And the best sources for Alexander are not the ones down at 280 and 300. The best two are Plutarch and Arian, and they're up at plus 4.25 to plus 450. Now, let's just think about that. Plus 4.25 to 450. They are written a half a millennium after Alexander died. All right, you go, well, and I have a book right behind me on the shelf here that compares different religions. It compares Islam, Christianity, and Buddhism. And when they talk about Buddha, they quite frequently say, a lot of books quite frequently say, Buddha said, Buddha taught, Buddha this, Buddha that. And our earliest sources for Buddha, as one Buddhist book by a Buddhist over there on my shelf, he says, I'm getting the best sources for Buddhism here. And he said virtually everything in this book comes from 600 to 800 years later. So it would make Alexander the Great look early. And by the way, someone goes, well, Buddha did those miracles too. The answer to that is, no way. Because in the earliest Buddhist documents from the Far East, from the countries right there in the area right near China, the earliest documents, Buddha, Confucius, and Lao Tzu, Taoism, the earliest documents for those three guys, they're not theists. They're not even theists. I wouldn't call them atheists. I mean, people in the world probably believed in some world spirit, or they believed in pantheism or something like that. But they didn't believe in a personal God who created anything that Jews or Christians or Muslims would recognize. They didn't believe in anything like that. And so when they go, well, Buddha did those miracles. Buddha was talking when the day he was born. Yeah, if you want to believe sources that are umpteen hundreds and hundreds of years later, and then by that time, guess what beats him out? The Gospels do. So wouldn't you want Buddha to look like Jesus and replicate some of the things of Jesus and mimic Jesus? And that happened oftentimes because the Gospel supposedly, we can't trace this, but the Gospel supposedly went through the Apostle Thomas to India, and people were very familiar in the India region and East about what Jesus did. So, I can throw a lot of others in here. Earliest theological sources for Zoroaster 1,000 years later. The Upanishads of Hinduism, 1,800 years later, earliest source. This one kills me. The earliest source for the Bhagavad Gita, if Krishna even lived, the earliest copy is 4,200 years after he was supposed to have lived.
Yeah.
Oh, well, that's no room for legend. Let me do a quick deal on my calculator. 4,200 divided by 40. That means that the Bhagavad Gita is 105 times the distance is 105 times the distance of the Gospel of Mark. Okay, so that kind of sets this up, and you go, okay, is Mark the best we can do? No, Mark's not the best we can do. What is? 1 Thessalonians, the Apostle Paul. Oh, well, do critics admit this? Absolutely, like 98%. When do they date 1 Corinthians? 50 AD, 50. Oh, so now we're down to 20. We just cut the distance between Jesus and the book and Jesus and Mark. We just cut it in half. Mm-hmm. So it's 20 years. And a bunch of other epistles follow right after that. For example, major critics, Jesus Seminar guys, Bart Ehrman, they date Paul's epistles from 50. One of them dates from 50 to 56. One of them says 50 to 60. My point is, you have a number of books coming in during those years. Now, here's the point. When 1 Thessalonians begins, Jesus is not spoken of like this. Oh, well, hey, guys, let me tell you about somebody. There's this Jewish prophet named Jesus, and I truly believe he was the Messiah, the Son of God, and Lord. Do you want me to tell you about him? No, he doesn't. 1 Thessalonians starts like this. You all know about the Lord Jesus Christ, who died for our sins, who was raised from the dead, and our Lord. And people don't go, who is this guy? They already knew about him. Why do they already know about him? Because when the apostles were going out and preaching between 30 and 50, they were using the creeds, the early oral testimony, to set the criteria up. And you go, well, how do I know they were recorded correctly? Well, we got some super good reasons to give. But one of the lesser reasons, but a really good one, is the reason they're authoritative is because the creeds said 20 years earlier what these epistles are saying in the 50s. They agree. They agree on the deity, death, resurrection of Jesus, that the major titles are Messiah, Son of God, and Lord. Major titles. What do the creeds say? Well, Romans 1, 3, and 4 says that by his resurrection, Jesus showed himself to be the Messiah, the Son of God, and Lord, all by the resurrection. Romans 10, 9, another creedal passage, says, if we confess with our mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in our hearts that God raised him from the dead, you'll be saved. Now, that's the gospel data, which is at a minimum is the deity, death, resurrection of Jesus. And that's Romans 10, 9. 3 verses later, Romans 10, 9, and then 10, it says you believe with the heart. 3 verses later, verse 13, Paul quotes an Old Testament verse that says whoever calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. Now, that sounds like a New Testament teaching. No, it's Old Testament, and it's in the minor prophets. And Lord there, whoever calls on the name of the Lord will be saved, is Jehovah. So when Paul says, if you confess with your mouth that Jesus, now Paul says it, but we'll learn here in a minute, the creeds are not Paul's. More about that in a second. But Paul records it. If you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord, what Lord do you mean? Do you mean Lord like Sir? Do you mean Lord like Master? No. 3 verses later, I mean Lord like Jehovah, because he's talking about whoever believes in the name of the Lord will be saved, Romans 10:9. 3 verses later, he says whoever calls the name of the Lord will be saved. Same context, but Lord is Jehovah. And again, he doesn't stop and say, hey, let me tell you about this guy. You don't know about him. He's this and that and this and that. No, they already knew because the oral preaching had been all over the. Now we still have to answer. How do we know that how early is are these oral creeds? Who do they come from? And here's the big question: how in the world would they be reliable? How can we trust them? But we have to admit, if they're really, really early, if they really, really came from the most authoritative sources, and if we could back that up. Oh, and by the way, P.S., do the critics agree? Yes, they do. Ludeman agrees. Ehrman agrees. Jimmy Dunn, James D. Dunn, unfortunately just passed away recently, but James D.G. Dunn says that early creed in 1 Corinthians 15 could have been dated just a few months after the cross. Well, since Jesus died in the spring, a few months means that early creed could be from the same year. Forget that 300-year gap for Alexander, the 800-year gap for Buddha. This could be the same year. You go, okay, I'm starting to get the picture. These are early reports. They're repeated. The disciples probably spread some of them around, but how do I know they're not hearsay? So I'll turn it back over to you, Dale. I was going on there forever, but that's what these early creeds are. They're oral testimonies that find their way into the New Testament books, but they're far earlier than these. In fact, they're not even hardly in the Gospels at all. So we're mostly talking the epistles, and they're much earlier. Now, the epistles start in the 50s, and these are much earlier. The Jesus Seminar, for example, the Jesus Seminar, who rejects, depending on how you count the colors, they reject 80 to 90% of the red letter words of Jesus, and yet they're going to tell you that 1 Corinthians 15, 3 and following, that creed, they're going to say it predated Paul's conversion, which happened about 2 to 3 years after the cross. So before Paul was converted at +2 or +3, that creed was already around. And Paul even says, I gave you what I was taught. He tells you it predates him. So anyway, fire away. That gives us a little bit of a basis for starting and why potentially the creeds are so powerful and so important.
Absolutely, yeah, that's why I love this evidence as well, because it's so important, because this material predates. This is the oral tradition before these early writings came in. But one thing I wanted to ask you, you sort of hinted at some reliability factors, but I'm just sort of curious. So we've talked about the Gospels and their Greco-Roman biography, and there's certain flexibility as to how the authors can write within that genre. Right. With regards to the creeds, what's sort of the flexibility range? Did that have to be word for word? Could they add stuff to it or modify the creeds? I'll turn it to you. What's sort of the flexibility within creeds?
I'd say 2 things. Number 1, there's pretty much agreement that some things could be added, but rarely and carefully. Okay, that's my first point. For example, I'll give you an example of it. 1 Corinthians 15, 3-7. Paul says, I delivered unto you that which I also received. He gives this creed. And at the end of the creed, which may be more than one creed, some people think Paul attached a few of them there with the appearances. But at the end of that list, Paul says, last of all, he appeared to me. Now, that doesn't really answer your question in this sense. If Paul were here, he'd say, excuse me, time out. I did not mess with the creed. I simply stopped quoting it and said, yeah, that happened to me too. I'm just adding what happened to me. I'm not putting me into the creed. He could say that, but you could also say he expanded the creed by putting his name at the end. But I think most people think there's the creed, and then Paul jumps in and gives his testimony. So my first answer would be there is some reason to believe that things could have been added, but they held this very highly, and we'll see why in a little while. But they held the creeds very highly, so they did not indiscriminately adjust those. But if some reader's thinking, okay, so these creeds are being cited a mere 20 years later, true, actually much earlier, because if like Jimmy Dunn, if they're around the first year or so afterwards, Bart Ehrman, the famous atheist New Testament scholar, Bart Ehrman dates these creeds, a bunch of them. He thinks a bunch of them fall into the 1 to 2 year slot after the crucifixion. He says it over and over again. A 1 to 2 year slot after the crucifixion prior to Paul's conversion. That's Bart, and he's an atheist. Atheist specialist in New Testament. You got the best of the best here if you want to quote somebody you don't agree with. So somebody could say, well, how do we know they just didn't copy and add hearsay to it? Okay, my second response to that is it's irrelevant. It is irrelevant. And I can get into that when you say, well, what's the background for it? I'll tell you why it's irrelevant. But one real good reason is we have so many creeds from so many angles, and about 80% of them or more are on the topic of what we call the gospel. They're on the deity, death, resurrection of Jesus. And not just one or two. They're usually on all three of those. The deity, death, resurrection. And, you know, I'm just making this up, but the creed might be, this man is Lord. He's Son of God and Lord. But we killed him, and God raised him from the dead. So you get all together in a little tiny passage there, and you go, well, how do you know that wasn't added to? Well, here's the problem. If you've got 20 or 25 creeds that find their way into the epistles mostly, why? And they come from all around the Mediterranean, right? I mean, historically, John preached and lived in Ephesus. Paul was in Rome. Mark was in Rome. Romans may have been written from there. We have guys living all over the place around the Mediterranean. They go to Greece. They go to what is Turkey today, to Italy, to Egypt, to India, even the case that we mentioned earlier about Paul. How come if the creeds were added to and destroyed, why do they all tell the same story? Why do they all tell the same thing? When they come from different viewpoints, from different sources, they should be wildly different. Like, for example, what if you're reporting this creed and you went to Greece or Turkey, and you're repeating the creed, and everybody, when you try to preach the gospel, everybody goes, yeah, Hercules was raised from the dead. Or you go to Egypt, and they go, Isis and Osiris, they were... And you try to answer those local questions in your creed, then you can see changes. But the creeds don't do that. They all do the same thing. Deity, death, resurrection. They don't compare Jesus to other people. They don't answer extraneous questions like, you know, how old is the earth, or what about eschatology? I'm not saying nothing else comes in there. I mean, for one thing, Romans 1:3-4 says that Jesus was born of a woman, but that's to emphasize, I think, the fact that he was a real man, because the creed also, that same creed also says he's the Messiah, the Son of God and Lord. So I think it's just saying he's deity. You know, he's a man, but he has it. So they rarely get off the subject of deity, death, resurrection. So I would say, since these creeds are all around the Mediterranean and in the works of several authors, but yet say the same thing, that's a really good argument they're not perverted. And yet, Dale, I would say that's only second or third or fourth on my list of why these things are trustworthy. There's a much stronger answer to why they are trustworthy.
That's fascinating, actually. So that's interesting. So in your research, you've discovered that the primary content that is consistent in all the various creeds is always related to either the deity, death, or resurrection of Jesus.
Almost always. I'd say off the top of my head, 80 to 90% of the creeds. And total creeds, I don't have a count. I got a document here that has it. I've actually taught a PhD course. I've taught a PhD course twice for PhD students on creeds. So you know the details are incredible. I've never counted. And that's because there are some that are borderline. Scholars, and I have this big document that Ben is editing that has a section on where are the creeds. And you might only have a couple of people say, I think that's a creed. Someone else doesn't even answer it. So it's hard to count them. But I'd say over 24 in the New Testament. And if you say, what are the ones that everybody agrees on, you're going to get a solid dozen and a half that every skeptical scholar, that there will hardly be a skeptical scholar around who won't agree that this is a creed. And remember, again, what's the definition of creed? It's an oral teaching that arises very early, that spread in the preaching and teaching of the apostles, and shows up in the first time in the New Testament epistles, beginning with 1 Thessalonians at 50 AD. That's a definition of the creeds. So let's put it this way. They're in the right place at the right time with the right data. Now we have to ascertain that the data are accurate. And I've given 2 reasons already. They'd be further along because I got better earlier ones. But the 2 I've already given are the creeds show up in the earliest New Testament books from 50 and following. It's extremely early. And secondly, when these creeds are coming from all over the place and different authors, why they all hit on the same themes. So that combination of diversity and earliness, I think, are 2 really good arguments.
All right. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to the rest of the time to what you wanted to focus on. Look, let's actually get into the specifics of specific creeds and that sort of thing. And just to sort of start off, I want to focus on the Acts sermon summaries because I think they're often not known or neglected among many atheists and skeptics and that sort of thing. So yeah, just can you give us sort of an introduction as to the Acts sermon summaries,
Sure.
what they contain? Because I debated Dr. Dale Tuggy, who's a famous Unitarian, on the Trinity, and one of his things is that he said none of the Acts sermon summaries cover the deity of Christ. So this proves that
that's crazy.
Yeah.
If all he wants you, that's easy. If all he wants you to do is give Acts sermon summaries, which critics say these are the Acts sermon summaries, all you got to do is look every one of them up and see how many of them call Jesus. The 2 highest names, titles for deity are Son of God and Lord. Messiah does not have to necessarily mean deity. It wasn't even a blasphemous charge if someone claimed to be the Messiah, because they could claim that just means anointed one. And in the Old Testament, they would anoint kings and prophets, and they're not God. So Messiah can mean deity, but doesn't have to mean deity. Son of God and Lord is the big one. And also, from the Acts sermon summaries, we get that Jesus was seated on the right hand of God. That's huge. It's not a title, but if Jesus is a co-regent on God's throne, dude, who do you think you are? Who are you claiming to be? Do you know what you're saying? And then, of course, Jesus' response is, yeah, I sort of know what I'm saying because my Father's going to prove this by raising me from the dead. For example, the book of Mark alone, I think Jesus predicts his death 5 or 6 times in that book alone. And it's pretty well accepted with critics that he really did do that. But regardless of whether he predicted it, I mean, that adds to the miraculous nature, supernatural nature. But if his Father raises him from the dead, why? Because he was a loser? Because he was a skeptic? Because he was a heretic? Because he was preaching false doctrine? I can't think of anything more blasphemous than these 2 things. I am deity. Now, that's a short way. He doesn't say it that way. But when he calls himself the Son of Man, most people mean Son of Man is just as high a term as Son of God is. So throw that one in there too. Son of God, Son of Man, and Lord. But you're not going to find Son of Man in the epistles. That's another whole story. But Son of God, Son of Man, and Lord are all going to be titles of deity. And in the epistles, you're not going to find Son of Man, but you are going to find Son of God and Lord. And when you add to that and say, I could be a co-regent on God's throne, I can't think of anything more blasphemous than to say, me, who's been around this earth for about 30 years, I'm going to co-reign with my Father, the God of the universe. Okay, and number 2, every religious teacher, including Jesus, said, I have the path to life, either current life, future life, or both. I have the path to life. Jesus said, I'm bringing the path to life. But only Jesus says, I'm the path of life. He makes a comment that philosophers would call an ontological claim. He talks about who he is in his essence. He is the path of life. So, 2 really bad claims if you're not these things. First of all, I'm the Son of God and Lord and a co-regent on God's throne. I'm deity. That's shorthand. I'm deity. And number 2, what you do with me determines where you spend eternity. And by the way, Rudolf Bultmann, who is to the left of most all of our critics today, Rudolf Bultmann, I'm paraphrasing that, but he would say, yeah, Jesus taught that he was the only path to God. They agree with these things. All right. So if you're going to claim those two things, I'm these titles of deity and including Son of Man, because the epistles don't do that, but Jesus did. And then secondly, what you do with me determines where you spend eternity. You better not be messing around, dude, because that's grounds for hellfire, just say it in the way the first century would. What? Either you're the son of God or you're going to hell, one or the other. And Jesus basically said, well, why don't we just wait and see? Remember when they asked him for a sign, he said, Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the fish. I'll be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. Well, dead men don't do much. So if he was raised from the dead, you tell me what's a better option than that he was who he claimed to be. So these are big time things. All right, back to Acts. Acts calls Jesus these things regularly. Calls him Lord. Says he's sitting on God's right hand. And the key chapters in Acts for these creeds are 1 through 5, 10, 13, and some people say Acts 17, Paul and Areopagus, and a few odd chapters. I told you about that book earlier, Semitisms in the book of Acts. He's got Semitisms all the way through the book of Acts, and those are agreed to indications that these traditions are really early. Again, tradition's a synonym for creeds, or roughly a synonym. So they're all over in Acts, but for sure, Acts 1 through 5, 10, and 13. And interestingly, 1 through 5 and 10 are Petrine. Peter's the speaker. 13 is Pauline. Paul's the speaker. So we get a little variety there too. Yeah, and you can just flip through these creeds. So the best little book to get on this it's an old one now, but the best little book to get to read about the Acts creeds is C.H. Dodd's little book, The Apostolic Preaching and Its Developments. The Apostolic Preaching and Its Developments first came out, if I'm not mistaken, 1936, because that was the time, 36 to 45. That's when these first books came out of the creeds, and critics were realizing the basis. You say, well, who was Dodd? Some fundamentalist preacher? No, he was a New Testament professor at Cambridge. That book, Oscar Coleman's book, a German theologian, he did one that was translated into French, German, and of course, English. And those come out right away. But Dodd's little book was republished about 1985 by Baker Books. And you could probably get it, anybody could probably get it on the internet used pretty inexpensively. And Dodd, really early in the book, about page 20, gives a list of where all the Acts sermon summaries are. Now, Dale, that raises a good question. I'm sure somebody's thinking, all right, you're throwing these things around like how do we know where these things are? Well,
I was just going to say it. How, first of all, how early are these things, and how reliable are they? Like, are there interpolations in them? Is it just hearsay? Like Bauckham argues that the recording of Jesus' testimony was very important, his sayings and doings, but did they treat the early apostles in the same way with regard to their sayings and doings, or was there more flexible there? So what's the history?
They're very careful about that. That's what's so important about this. But somebody could say, how do we know where these things are? Well, before I give a reason, which I can do easily, but before I give a reason, it's amazing that if you ask New Testament authors that are atheists, agnostics, Jewish, they're Jewish non-Christians, but they're New Testament authors, like Pinchas Lapid, who had a PhD in New Testament. You ask these guys, and they all agree where the creeds are. They all agree, at least the major ones. And they're going to be Romans 1, 3, and 4, Romans 10, 9. I already mentioned those two. The best known one is 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 to 7. Another one, really well-known one, 1 Corinthians 11, what we call the communion or Eucharist passage, where Paul says, I gave you what I was given, how that Jesus was the same night which you betrayed, took bread, and broke it, gave thanks. This is my body, which is broken for you, which, by the way, is the gospel again. This is my body, which is broken for you. And he's called Lord there. All right. Another major one is 1 Corinthians 8, 6, where it's believed that in the earliest preaching, Jesus' name was brought into the Shema. so that Jesus was put in the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. Lord and God are both in the Shema. Early interpreters in the creeds made God the Father and Lord the Son. And it's right there, 1 Corinthians 8:6, where Jesus is brought into the Shema under the second deity name there of Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. Philippians 2 is huge, where every knee will bow, every tongue will confess. And Isaiah is quoted where Isaiah says, God says, I will not share my glory with anybody else. And yet everybody's sharing, bowing down to Jesus and so on. So it's major evidence there. Now, those are some of the best ones. Romans 1, Romans 10, 1 Corinthians 15, 1 Corinthians 11, 1 Corinthians 8, Philippians chapter 2. I'm sure I'm leaving a number of them out, but those are the major ones. And when you look these things up, the scholars, the critics, who don't even accept the truth of Christianity, will tell you where these are. You go, well, okay, fine. How do they all agree? And they'll go, okay, that's because of what a creed is. You go, yeah, well, I've been waiting for this. How do you know what it is? Well, first of all, you got to be really good in Greek. You got to be able to read Greek inside and outside, because reading a creed has to do with syntactical things and breaks. The best way I can explain it is this. If you are writing an essay for a professor and you want to quote John Doe, you say, John Doe says. And if it's a long quote, you block it, and you always have a reference at the end. And if you don't have a footnote, the professor's going to say in the margin, source, ? Okay. But how do you know that you're starting to quote John Doe? Well, the easy answer would be because you started blocking the quote. And in our modern day, if I go to John Doe's book, I can find this and I can tell what the quote is. But in the early church, they could tell because the syntax is different, the tense is different. Let's say you're speaking, they're not so careful in those days as we are. Maybe the author is speaking in first person and John Doe is speaking in third person. Or maybe they cut into the quote in an awkward place and the creed doesn't follow real easily. And what's the professor write on your paper? When you try for 15 minutes to get your words to lead into the quote, but you can't make them jive. Anybody who writes graduate papers knows what this is like. And you go, oh, heck with it. And you just start quoting. And the teacher writes in the margin, awkward transition. Creeds are awkward transitions. If you know Greek really, really well, you would say, well, look, he's changed tense here. It's awkward. He has a long quote, but he's using 6 words in this paragraph that don't show up anywhere else. In the case of Paul, in the many epistles that he writes, he never uses these 6 words anywhere else. And besides, Paul introduced 3 of these, especially 1 Corinthians 11, 1 Corinthians 15. He introduced them by saying, I gave you what I was given. Yeah, I call that with my students today, that's a first century footnote. When you say, I gave you what I was given, what you're saying is, today we would go, and even John Doe says, I was taught this. I'm giving you what I was taught back then. What are they saying? This isn't my material. As simple as that. So I think the clearest example of a creed is where over and over again in the New Testament, you get these phrases. Here are the traditions of the elders, and they quote, or they'll say, obey what we were given to you when we came to Corinth, because it's also 1 Corinthians 11 also talks about traditions. So for all these reasons, the author tells you that's what it is, that syntax is broken, you change things like person or number. You can tell it's a citation of somebody else. But when they tell you it is, like I gave you something I've received, that's the best indication. But earlier I said it's really irrelevant. It's irrelevant if we have the exact words. And you go, does that just defeat everything you said? Because I know we've got really close to those words and everybody agrees to that. But here's the place where it's most evidential. After saying all this, I got to say this real clearly. I don't care where the creeds come from, how early they are, who they come from. In a way, yes, that goes against everything you said. Well, see, I don't think that's true, so I think we have a good basis. But even if it weren't true, I don't need the creeds to be true. I need backup for the statements in the creeds. Okay? So let's deal with those three things super quickly. Deity of Christ, death, resurrection. If I just tell you without a creed, Dale, I'm going to tell you why Jesus was the Son of God and Lord. Dale, he died on the cross for our sins. And then Dale, he was raised again from the dead. You could probably care less whether those are creeds. You want to know, what is your backup for those 3 points? I don't care if it's in a creedal form or if it's in a prose, if it's a narrative, it's one of the Gospels. I want to know your data for these things. And that's where the creeds look the best. And there I would say this. And by the way, what I'm going to say next, Bart Ehrman calls this one of the 2 best evidences for the historical Jesus. The first one being that according to Bart Ehrman, atheist New Testament scholar, according to Bart, we have 15 sources for the crucifixion of Jesus from within 100 years of Jesus' death. Now take that 100 years, compare it to Buddha, compare it to Alexander. That's great. Bart says, I'm going to give you 100 years. Anything in the 100 years is good. And he gives 15 references, and 4 of them minimum. I have to go back and look. There might be a half dozen of them, but 4 to 6 of them are not even in the New Testament. So critics who say, I won't accept the New Testament source, good, great for you. I know you're going to deny it no matter what. I know you're going to come up with some silly reason not to believe it no matter what I say, but I've got several sources for you that are outside the New Testament. Now what do you do with it? Oh, well, that's this and that and this and that. They're always going to have reasons. But what I mean is we can fulfill their criteria not to use New Testament. So his first evidence is the death of Jesus is heavy. It's the evidence is really big. Okay, second one, Paul. A lot of people, I'm doing a chapter right now for my big magnum opus. I'm editing a chapter on how do we know Jesus really saw Paul really saw Jesus on the way to Damascus. And most people think the best evidence from Paul is he believed he saw Jesus and he was a radical critic who didn't mind killing people for believing in Christianity. He was changed so that combination of from radical critic to radical Christian because of the resurrection. Everybody thinks that's the best evidence. Well, I think it's pretty good, but I don't think it's the best evidence Paul brings to the table. The best evidence Paul brings to the table, and this is Bart Ehrman says this, I'm just teasing. I was ready to say he must have copied from me because I said it for 20 years before he said it in print. No, I'm just kidding. Paul comes to Christ about 2 to 3 years after the cross. So if the cross is 30 AD, 32 to 33, he's on his way to Damascus. He says he meets the risen Jesus. Okay. Bart Ehrman says the following things about these early creeds. And then we'll tell you why they're reliable. Bart says it's possible that every creed Paul has, and Paul has the majority of the creeds. Somebody might say, why Paul? Well, come on, the guy had a PhD in Old Testament. Basically, he studied. He was a great memorizer. He was a Pharisee, which is the best of the memorizers. He knows how to study. He knows how to impart. He knows how to debate because he graduated from the Pharisee school. So he's the guy to do this. Ehrman says that it's possible that every creed in Paul, these are earth shakers. Each one of these phrases is powerful. Ehrman says they probably were all in existence before Paul's conversion, or at least they could have been. They probably all come from Jerusalem. They didn't come from Greek sources, Egyptian sources, Syrian sources. They were already in existence. So far, pre-Pauline, before Paul's conversion. Number 2, all coming from Jerusalem. Here's Bart Ehrman. Could have come from the other eyewitnesses. They could have been. In fact, it makes most sense that this is what the apostles were preaching. Who else would you listen to? Would you listen to Peter or would you listen to John Doe? So you're going to hear this from the apostles. Okay, so pre-Pauline, from Jerusalem, he could have heard them from the apostles. Now let's fill out the rest of the picture. So he's on his way to Jerusalem. These creeds are already around. He's got to know what they are because they infuriated him, and that was the heart of the early preaching. So he's on his way. He says he met the risen Jesus. He already knows the creeds. 3 years later, Galatians 1, and again in Galatians 2, he does it twice. He goes up to Jerusalem to talk to those who were apostles before him. He calls them the pillars of the church. In Galatians 1, he spends 15 days with Peter and James, the brother of Jesus. In Galatians 2, when he goes back up, Peter's still there, James is still there, and now John is there. And what's significant is these are the big four. I mean, Barnabas is there, Titus comes. There's some big names in the early church. You go out of your way to hear Barnabas or Titus, but you'd really go out of your way to hear Peter, Paul, James, and John. They're the most influential Christians. Okay, he interviews them in Galatians chapter 1, verse 18. The Greek word is hysteresis, and the word hysteresis is variously translated. It could be, the English kills it. It just says he saw them or he talked to them. But the Greek word could mean anything from he interviewed them to he dialogued with them. He definitely got in, and you know, just knowing Paul's brain and the way he works from his epistles, you know, there was some pushing here. He's the new convert. He's only been a Christian for 3 years. Pushing like, how do you know that? Wait, let me stop you. How about that phrase? You know, that's just who Paul is. But he says in 1:18, I went up there to learn this. What's the theme of the very short book of Galatians? In fact, Paul says, don't make it smaller than it is. That's heresy. Don't make it more than it is. That's heresy. Let's stay on target. And the target for sure is deity, death, resurrection, whatever else you mentioned. Those are there. So what was he talking to Peter and James about in Galatians chapter 1? Hysteresis. They had to be talking about the gospel. When he goes back in Galatians 2, he specifically says they were talking about the gospel. In Galatians, I set before them the gospel I was preaching to see if I was running or had run in vain. Well, okay. So did Peter, James, the brother of Jesus, and John agree with you? Well, right after Paul says that in 2:2, he says, in English, just 5 words, they added nothing to me. They added nothing to me. And then a few verses later, verse 9, they gave Barnabas and me the right hand of fellowship. You don't give right hand of fellowship. It's like laying hands on missionaries going off the mission field. You don't give the right hand of fellowship to heretics. You know, one New Testament book says don't even invite them into your house because you're going to share their false doctrine. And that probably means don't invite them into your house to talk to your house church. You know, don't let them teach your people. But the point is, they took that stuff very seriously. And they added nothing to me. And then just a few verses later, they gave us a right hand of fellowship. Okay, now here's what it means. Paul clearly spoke about the gospel during the 2 weeks in Galatians 1, 15 days. And when he came back in Galatians 2, he specifically says we talked about the gospel. What's the gospel? 1 Corinthians 15:3. Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, was buried, rose again the 3rd day according to the scriptures, and appeared. He died, buried, rose, appeared. Now, Paul hears this from the other big 3. How do you know again? They're discussing the gospel. What's the gospel? Deity, death, resurrection. I almost don't care what's in the creeds, Dale. They're discussing the content. And the reason I know they got it right was because he went to the horse's mouth. He went to the, counting himself, he was before the 4 greatest experts in the ancient world. And they agreed. Now let me ask, does Paul think he saw the risen Jesus? Absolutely. Peter think he saw the risen Jesus? Absolutely. Does James, the brother of Jesus, think he saw the risen Jesus? Absolutely. Does John think he saw the risen Jesus? Absolutely. How do you know? Well, one reason is you got the Gospels. The appearance of the 12 is so well. Peter and James aren't. Paul and James aren't there, but that's so well accredited. But 3 of those names are in the early creed. He appeared first to Peter, and then Paul says he appeared to James, and he adds his name. Last of all, he appeared to me. Right there in that early text, 3 of their names are right there. So you can't talk about the gospel without the resurrection. The guys are right here who saw the risen Jesus. Yes, I care that the creeds all make the grade, but these guys ensure that what was preaching was true. No, Paul, let me stop you there. He wasn't exactly deity. come on, Paul, that's heresy. No, they added nothing to me. They gave me the right hand of fellowship. Well, he died. Yeah, that's all over every Christian piece of literature, and everybody dies. No big deal. He was raised from the dead. Yeah, that's very clearly throughout the New Testament. So it's almost like the creeds are there and early and strong, but it's almost irrelevant. What is important is the early testimony, which is backed up by the biggest guys here. That's the biggest reason. That's how we know it's true. And so when you put it together, Dale, you got very, very early. Bart Ehrman says 1 to 2 years. Jimmy Dunn says it may have been the early creed might have come about the same year that all these things happened to Jesus. Very early. Gert Ludeman says 3 years at the latest. He's an atheist. These things are widely admitted early from the best possible sources, reported beginning in 50 AD with the data, but it's already been preached around the whole Mediterranean. There's a lot of checks and balances here, and that's why I think the creeds are the best data for the gospel evidence. I just went on and on and on and on. I hope you're. I know you got. No. I know you well enough to know you got a lot of questions, but that just kind of lays it all out.
Yeah, no. That's exactly what I wanted. The way we scheduled it and worked it out. I wanted you to give your generalized case about the significant evidence of these creeds, and I just wanted to back you up. A very important point that I want to get through to the audience and the Christians and skeptics that listen to the show is, a lot of times you can get wrapped up in the debates about precise words. You can lose the forest for the trees, so to speak, because this specific word was inserted, or no, but the essential gist of the message. Paul was there. He spoke to these pillars, and the essential gist, the deity, death, and resurrection of Jesus, the gospel, is still there, whether or not it's debatable about this word or this phrase or something like that. So yeah, I think that's a great point to back up. All right, cool. So we're actually past the 1 hour mark. So you asked me to do it for 1 hour. Do you mind if I just ask one other quick question? All right, cool.
But Dale, while we're at, I'll tell you what. I'll summarize at the very end. I'll summarize how many backups we have for these creedal data. I've already given like almost a half dozen so far in the lecture, but people may not have picked those out. So I'd be glad to slow down and talk about, where the data are that back it up. Anyway, fire away.
Yeah, if you, and like, so are you saying you'd like to go a bit longer? Like, I'm happy to do whatever works for you.
No, I mean, when you get done with your question, I'll give a quick list that simply summarizes what I've already said. That tells us why these creeds are so reliable.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. Cool. So yeah, just a very general question, and nothing too specific on any specific creed, but just in general, what do you think from the perspective of these atheist or skeptical scholars? You said they concur with a lot of what you've been saying. What is the biggest objection that they give to the evidence from the creeds? Like, what is the biggest objection that you hear on this?
You've talked to a lot of skeptics. It's almost like I could say it this way. Here's their biggest objection. ... And not tell you what it is. Because my point is, a person who doesn't want to believe is not going to believe. And the reason they give is unimportant. All you have to hear them say is, yeah, maybe some other time, not today. And that's the main thing they're after. I always use the example, if we were best friends and I thought you should be married, so I introduced you to a friend of mine, and I just think if you dated this person a few times, you'd agree with me and you'd be ready to get married. And make a long story short, you did, and you came back to me and said, fantastic. Yeah. Everything you said was true. And I said, can I be your best man? And you said, hey, look, there's a little logical gap in what you've done. Your assumption is, because this is the neatest person I've ever met, therefore I want to get married. You're missing something. I don't want to get married. Maybe 20 years, and this would be the kind of person I'm looking for, but not now. Okay, so a decision to base all my life on this, it's like, you've sold me. This is a really good investment, but you don't understand. My investments are all tied up right now. So why didn't you tell me that in the first place? I would have saved a couple hours. People aren't free to make the best decisions sometimes. And and you can give the critics excellent evidence. There's more evidence. Listen, I've studied the world religions, and when you debate with people, they'll do this. Well, yeah, that's pretty good evidence for the life of Jesus, but are you aware that Buddha did miracles? Huh. Let me tell you about Buddha's miracles. Do you mean the ones that are recorded 600 years later or 800 years later? Which ones are these great stories? Oh, I don't know. I didn't even know they were written that late. Yeah, they are. Let me quote this Buddha scholar to you that says that. In fact, this book behind me on the shelf that I'm looking at right here, he says that of Muslims, Christians, and Buddhists, Christians have the best historical backup. Muslims are next, and Buddhists are not on the playing field. That's basically what he says. He says their sources are way too late. So if a person doesn't want to get married, they're not going to get married. They'll think of other reasons, but they don't have to give you reasons. If I go, Dale, you're my best friend. Why won't you get married to Jesus? Why won't you say, I do to Jesus? Because I think when you say better or worse, rich or poor, sickness and health till death do we part, that's really similar to the commitment a believer makes to Jesus. We say, all of you can have all of me. That's a short way to say what we do when we come to Christ, right? Mm-hmm. Why, if I'm a skeptic, why do I have to give you a reason? Why can't I just say, what do you think about these evidences? And what would you say to me to answer these? And here's my response to you, Dale. No. Well, come on, give me your response. No. Give me your best answer. How do you spell no? Why not? I don't want to. Those aren't good reasons. I don't care. See, it's irrelevant. We can say what the best comebacks would be, but there aren't good comebacks to this kind of thing. When Garrett Ludeman, I've been quoting a lot of guys. Pinchas Lapid, the non-Christian Jewish New Testament scholar. Gezer Vermesh, the agnostic Jewish New Testament scholar. He was an historian at Oxford. A lot of other guys. E.P. Sanders, who taught at Oxford and Duke University, E.P. Sanders gives a list of the things we can know about Jesus for sure that everybody agrees on. Guess what one of them is? One of them is, after his death, he appeared to his disciples again. He goes, I don't know how, I don't know where, but he appeared to them. Dale Allison, who's a very well-known skeptic, nice guy. He and I are good, we're good friends. He's a really nice guy. But Dale, after giving all the skepticism in his book, he says this. And I told him one time, last time we were together, I said, this is my favorite sentence about you, Dale. You say, whatever else you say, he says, I have no doubt that after Jesus died by crucifixion, he appeared again to his disciples. Now, if that's Dale, and if that's E.P. Sanders, and if that's Pinchas Lapid, wow, the Jewish New Testament scholar says that? Yes, he does. He says Jesus was raised from the dead. Ehrman and Ludeman don't believe that. I know, they don't want to get married, but they do agree with the evidence. What else is there? Just go ahead and say no and tell me you don't want to talk to me anymore. You don't have to make up, you don't have to say things. No, I think there's a really good objection, and you give it to me. Okay, those guys who give really good objections, let's work on it together.
Yeah.
But don't say to me, yeah, but the Old Testament teaches genocide.
You have no idea how much I've heard that. Sorry.
Oh, I know, and it makes people so angry. Here's the number one objection I can tell you from reading the sources from 1800 to date. Here's the most common objection. But the gospel's full of contradictions. And I will say, okay, look, friend, I will get any number of skeptics you want. Robert Funk, Jesus Seminar member. E.P. Sanders from Oxford and Duke. I will Gezer Vermesh from Oxford, a non-Christian Jew. I will list these guys, and I will tell you what they say we can know about Jesus. And you go, you're not hearing me. There's a lot of contradictions. Well, guess what? I'll bet you these scholars won't give you the facts where they think there's contradictions because they think there's contradictions. But they're going to give you the list where they think it's all true. And I'm making a case based on what scholars think is true. Now what do you say? Well, they're wrong. Great. You can think that. But that's not a good response. So if they come up with a good response, I'll hear it. But don't tell me the Gospels have contradictions. I'm talking about the passages where nobody thinks there are contradictions and where all the evidence is in favor. Well, there's genocide in the Old Testament. Fantastic. You go believe whatever you want to about that. But I want to know about the deity, death, resurrection of Jesus. So I try to keep them on task because Jesus says what you do with me determines where you spend eternity. I want them on the yellow brick road, so to speak, looking for the Emerald City, not getting out in the cornfield on the side of the yellow brick road, wondering about what happened with the genocide passages. So I want to keep him on task here. And then I say, hey, look, we're good friends. If you come to me in 2 years and want to talk about the genocide passages, I'll talk about them with you. I'll do it. But let's stay on target here, because if I let you go to genocide and I let you go to contradictions, you're going to try to get me off the path, and that's not a good answer. It's not a good answer to push me off the path instead of dealing with my data.
Yeah.
So I don't know a good response, Dale. I really don't. I went through years and years and years and years of skepticism, and you know what? I reached a point in my skepticism where I quit for a few years, and I said to myself, believe it or not, who would say this about me? I said, I can believe the resurrection, but I don't think it can be demonstrated. I can believe it, but you can't prove it happened. You said that? I did. And I laid the books down for about 2 years. I was in college. I laid the books down for about 2 years because I didn't think it could be proven. Could be believed. I would object. By the way, Bart Ehrman says that. Bart Ehrman says you can believe this till the cows come home. You have a right to believe it. In fact, he calls that evidence. I don't call that evidence, but he says you can believe in the resurrection, but don't say you could show it happened. By the way, one more line for Bart Ehrman. Bart Ehrman says you cannot prove that God raised Jesus from the dead. He says you can't prove that. And then before he finishes the sentence, if I remember correctly, it's either the rest of that sentence or the next sentence, he goes, but let me say something else. You can't disprove it either. So that the best-known atheist New Testament scholar says, you can't prove it, but we can't prove the opposite. He'd let us get all the way to first and second base. We've only got a couple more bases to go to make it to home, So I'm happy with that. And he admits almost all this data that I mentioned today, almost all of it. So does Garrett Ludeman.
Yeah, that's been my experience as well. Is like when you're trying to answer, when you pin them down on the actual specific evidence, and okay, let's figure out the truth about these creeds. We're talking about these creeds here. They will evade to something else or an irrelevant issue to get out of it.
It might be, Dale, as you know, and I feel sorry for them, but it could very well be why they're so stinking angry at the church because somebody hurt them. A pastor had an affair. They were dating a person, and the person broke up with them. But the reason the person broke up with them was because they weren't a Christian, and the person wanted to follow the Lord, and now they can't stand Christians. I mean, you hear that. I commiserate with those kind of answers, but it doesn't refute the arguments. Stay on target, refute the facts, which even Bart Ehrman, Garrett Ludeman, Geza Vermesh, Pincus Lapide, I can give E.P. Sanders, I can give a list of others, James D.G. Dunn, these guys. There's going to hardly be anything I said that they're going to disagree with. Throw Richard Bauckham in there. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, the late Larry Hurtado, 2 of the 3 major guys who do these early Christology have now passed away, Dunn and Hurtado, and only Bauckham remains, and he's fairly elderly. I mean, those guys are still around. We should get their writings where they're still there, but they would all agree with what I've said. In fact, one time I was given this lecture that incorporated all this about the creeds and everything. I was doing it in Cambridge, and I looked up and I just started my lecture, and Richard Bauckham came into the room. Wasn't real deep. It was broad, like a saucer type room, and he came in the back. I was probably only 30 feet away from him, and he sat down, and I just had lunch with him a couple months before, so I knew who he was, and of course I knew from his writings. But after it was over, I asked him, I said, Richard, did I know I took your name in vain during this thing. Did I say anything you don't believe? He said, no, I'm okay with this. I think everything you said was true. I said, okay, Richard, you're really, really kind. Give me one critique. Here's his one critique. He said, you're doing the creeds today, and you didn't mention Oscar Coleman's book, The Early Christian Confessions. And he goes, you didn't mention the best book on the subject. Well, first of all, I think that book has been, I think there's a better book out there now, but Oscar Coleman, I edited the book. I re-edited it and brought it back into print. It's available for whiff and stock because Ben Shaw, my TA, and I brought it back into print. But I think Coleman's great, but I chuckled when he said that because I'd been at Oxford about 4 days before that at Oxford University College, at one of the colleges, and I gave the same lecture, and I mentioned Oscar Coleman's book, but I didn't do it this time. So he said, okay, if I was going to give you a critique, you'd have mentioned Oscar Coleman. I said, I can handle that, but you agree with all the facts. He goes, I agree with all your facts. So that's the great Richard Bauckham. So awesome. I'm not trying to say I'm special. Here I am. I'm saying these facts are special. These data are special.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, concentrate on the facts. If it's about truth, that's how you're going to get there, kind of thing. So,
That's what Anthony Flew said when he became a theist late in his life, the famous philosophical atheist. He said, "I had to go where the evidence led."
yeah.
Ultimately, that's what decision you made, decision I made. That's what we did. Do you want me to give that list real fast of how we know the the creeds are historical?
Absolutely. Yeah, give your closing statement there.
All
And
right, I'll give a list of reasons here. Number
okay.
one, they are extremely early. Ehrman, Ludeman, Dunn, everybody lists them to the first year or two after the crucifixion. Ehrman says 1 to 2 years. And someone could say, well, that doesn't mean it's true. I'll say, well, great, hear me out. Oh, by the way, a lot of people would say, you keep quoting scholars for why you think it's true. Quoting scholars doesn't make it true. You are right. But the reason I keep quoting atheists, agnostics, Jewish New Testament scholars is because they wouldn't believe these things at the heart of Christianity because they're not Christians. They wouldn't believe them unless they thought the data were good. It's far more important that there's good data than there are that the big name scholars agree with them. But when I tell you Ehrman agrees with this, that might just make you stop and evaluate what the data are. The data are way more important. Okay,
Mhm.
number one, they're very, very early. Number two, they come from very authoritative sources. You go, how do you know? It was because the best reason is Paul interviewed these guys twice in Jerusalem, once just 5 years after his conversion. That event, the consensus New Testament position, skeptical and liberal, is that that event took place about 35 AD, give or take a few months, 35 AD, because Paul tells us what had happened. He
Mhm.
came to Christ 2 to 3 years after the cross. He said 3 years later he was in Jerusalem. He told us that. So this meeting in Jerusalem happens at either +5 or +6. So number one, very, very early. Number two, he's talking to the horse's mouth. He's talking to the guys who were there. Who? Well, he was there. He said he saw the risen Jesus, Paul. He interviewed Peter. He interviewed James. Both their names are in the early creed. Paul's added to the early creed. That's three. Then the next time he comes back to talk about the gospel, John's there. So the big four are there. They're talking about the gospel. You can't talk about the gospel without the resurrection. You know what? If I'm Paul, Dale, if I'm Paul, here's my question. Here's my one question for these other three guys. Guys, I bet you wonder what a good Pharisee like me is doing in a place like this after criticizing Jesus. I'll tell you what happened to me if you tell me what happened to you. I met Jesus on the road to Damascus. Here's the details. Peter and John, you were there together. Could you tell me what it was like? You saw them in groups. Can we talk about that? James, you were later, but I know you were an unbeliever, but you were later. Can you tell me what you saw? How do you walk away from being with those guys, talking about the resurrection, because they said the topic was the gospel? How do you get away from them and not ask, what was it like to meet the risen Jesus? And I'll tell you what it was like on the way to Damascus. So, number one, very, very early. Number two, we got it from the guys who knew, and who, by the way, we have martyrdom sources, first century martyrdom sources for Paul, James, and Peter. I tell people they didn't just die for their faith; they died for the resurrection. Well, how do you know that? You're just saying that. No, they died for their faith. The gospel is the center of their faith. The resurrection is the center of the gospel. Paul said, "If there's no resurrection, there's no faith." So, if they thought the resurrection were not true, they're not dying for it. So they died for the resurrection. So that puts a little kicker on it. So
Mhm.
very, very early. Well, I can even throw that in later about their persecution. But very, very early, eyewitness testimony. Number three, the data of these creeds are written down very early, beginning with First Thessalonians in 50 A.D. That's a mere 20 years later. So they were written down early. Four, we have a lot of diversity because they come from different authors, different places. These things come from around the Mediterranean, and they all repeat the same thing. So a lot of diverse agreement. Five, all these guys were transformed to the point of being willing to die. I can't prove all the disciples died as heretics, but they were all willing to die. You go, well, how do you get inside their head? How do you know they're willing to die? I don't have to get inside their head. I just look where their feet went. If you keep going to the town where you were beat up twice and you go back into it again to preach, I guess you're willing to die. You know,
Mhm.
Paul's shipwrecked several times. He was whipped 40 lashes minus one several times. He was stoned and left for dead, and his disciples came to bury him. They found he was alive. You don't keep going to those places. So that would be my next one. So what is that? Is that five?
That's
Number one,
fun.
very early, authoritative, written early in First Thessalonians, diverse because they're repeated all over the place and they're always the same. They were willing to die specifically for these messages. And I would add that of these four guys, two of them, James and Paul, are skeptics. Call that a sixth, or call that a sixth and a seventh reason. They both had to come to Jesus for a reason. They had to walk away from a very, I mean, that's special. I'm his brother, and I was raised with Jesus, and I didn't believe, and I became a believer. And Paul, I was persecuting Christians, thinking I did God a favor, and I came. Those are special cases. So those are 5 or 6 reasons. And after, as soon as we get off the machine here, I'll think of another 1 or 2. But for right now, those are the best reasons. Early, coming from eyewitness testimony, reported within 20 years, diverse audiences all reporting the same thing. The fact that they were all willing to die, and we have first century martyrdom for at least Peter, Paul, and James. By the way, we have a second century source for the martyrdom of John, but that's more questionable because it's later. And then we have Paul and James, 2 skeptics, very special kinds of skeptics who come to the Lord. I think that's excellent evidence. And people who want to say the creeds are hearsay, I'd say, well, look, I'm just taking great pains to show you they're not, but I really don't care what you think. If you don't like the creeds, refute the testimony of Peter, Paul, James, and John, which Paul passes on to us, and Ehrman calls this one of the 2 greatest evidences for the historicity of Jesus. So the case we have here, I think, you can say you don't want to get married. You can get angry and say someone hurt me. You can say Christians are bums. You can say whatever you want to, but it doesn't change the data.
Perfect. All right. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Gary, for sharing your expertise and your latest research on the creeds there.
Boy, you brought out the best of me. I can't wait to put this on my YouTube channel.
Oh, absolutely. I'll give you the permission, whatever you need. So, yeah. So yeah, I'm glad. Hopefully, sorry.
I said I'll send it to my guy as soon as you send it to me.
All right, sounds awesome. Perfect. So yeah, I'll put this up right away, just for the audience, so they know what I have coming up next. So the next show I'm going to have is with Dr. Michael Behe and Marvin Wallace on the topic of intelligent design. And Gary, you mentioned Dale Allison. So I've reached out to him during my research phase as well. And one of my listeners, Joan Venter, he asked me to invite Dale on, so I did. But unfortunately, he said he has philosophical and private reasons that he doesn't like to do recordings and stuff. But I did try for the listener there. So yeah, so look forward to seeing Michael Behe.
He's got a new big book. Dale's got a new big book coming out on the resurrection.
Oh, does he? Okay.
Yeah, he wrote me an email and he said you're gonna like some of the things I say and you're not gonna like some of the things I'm gonna say. but he's the guy. He's the guy who says he calls himself a deist, meaning I don't know if God got involved in the world, but there is a God. But he's the guy who said after Jesus' death, he's positive that the disciples saw him alive again. So yeah. And by the way, I have a festschrift coming out where a bunch of guys, I don't even know about it, but a bunch of guys wrote essays in my honor and the resurrection. The book's due out in the next few months, and Dale wrote one of those chapters.
Oh, wow. Perfect.
So did Barry Schwartz, the
really?
the Jewish non-Christian shroud scholar who believes that the man buried in the shroud is Jesus and he's absolutely dead, and he doesn't know how the image got there, but Barry wrote a chapter and Dale wrote a chapter. So I'm real pleased with those kind of testimonies.
Excellent. Perfect. All right. So
you reached out to them too.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, they're both great guys. I mean, Dale's always been helpful in my private, and obviously Barry Schwartz has been on the show, and he's always been helpful just like you. So, yeah, hopefully the audience enjoyed the show, and I guess have a great week, everybody.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.